The jungle of South America is not merely a geographic location. It is an indifferent, suffocating wall of green that swallows sound, light, and technology with equal malice. For the cartel soldiers guarding the fortified complex deep within the basin, this environment was a sanctuary. For the US military, it was a data void, a place where their precious information dominance went to die. But the Americans, blinded by the hubris of their own procurement budgets, refused to accept that. They were convinced that what the jungle couldn't provide, sheer overwhelming mechanical force could buy. A high-value CIA asset had been snatched from a regional station 3 days prior. He was now being held in a sprawling, multi-tiered facility built into the riverbank, a location that, according to the Pentagon, required a deliberate high kinetic assault. They didn't just want the asset back, they wanted to send a message. And so the US military brought the show. The insertion force consisted of the Navy's elite SWCC, Special Warfare Combatant Craft Crewmen, teams of operators who prided themselves on being the fastest, loudest, and most heavily armed water-borne unit in the world. They arrived in a fleet of heavily modified, armored, high-speed tactical boats. These weren't just boats, they were floating tanks, draped in Kevlar composite, carrying mounted GAU-17 miniguns, capable of putting out thousands of rounds of 7.62mm ammunition per minute. The SEAL teams on board were dressed in the absolute apex of the American operator aesthetic. Custom-fit ballistic helmets with integrated NVG mounts, ceramic-plated vests that would stop a rifle round at 10 meters, and digital encrypted comm suites that cost more than a small business's annual revenue. The plan was textbook shock and awe, an American favorite. They would scream up the river at 60 knots, the roar of their engines echoing off the canyon walls like the coming of an apocalypse.
They believed that by the time the enemy realized they were being attacked, the miniguns would have already turned the riverside camp into a field of shredded foliage and broken bodies. They relied on their sophisticated thermal optics to paint the targets and their GPS-synchronized timing to ensure that every boat arrived on the target line at the exact same second. But the jungle does not care about your budget, and it certainly does not care about your tactical timeline. 3 miles out, the river narrowed into a choke point, a section of the waterway where the current was sluggish and the banks were lined with dense, impenetrable mangrove roots. The Americans didn't slow down. They didn't look for a covert path. They relied on their speed, convinced that their velocity would outrun any potential threat. It was a fatal miscalculation. They were driving into a trap that had been set not by a master tactician, but by a group of narco-militants who had spent their entire lives living in the mud. The first hint of trouble wasn't a sophisticated sensor alert. It was the sound of a heavy-caliber DShK machine gun, a Cold War-era beast that had been bolted to a reinforced concrete pillar on the riverbank. It didn't need a computer-assisted fire control system. It just needed a man with a steady hand. When the DShK opened up, the sound wasn't a rhythmic rattle. It was a rhythmic, bone-crushing thud, 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 thud that tore through the river air. The first stream of rounds impacted the lead boat's bow, punching through the Kevlar armor as if it were cardboard. The miniguns on the SEAL boats began to spin up, their distinctive, high-pitched whir cutting through the night, but they were firing blindly. They had no targets. The insurgents were buried in dugout spider holes, invisible to the thermal sensors because they were covered in thick, heat-absorbing mud. Within 10 minutes, the Hollywood raid had devolved into a massacre.
The lead boat was taking on water, its engine block shattered by a rocket-propelled grenade. The second boat was grounded on a sandbar, its crew pinned down by an unrelenting hail of machine gun fire from both banks. The SEALs were trapped in the funnel of their own making, unable to maneuver, unable to see the enemy, and unable to suppress a foe that they couldn't even identify.
They were screaming for air support, but the canopy of the jungle was so thick that the pilots of the hovering gunships couldn't see anything but trees. The Americans had spent millions on night vision goggles, but they were now blinded by the flashes of the enemy's muzzle blasts. They had spent millions on encrypted radios, but the only thing coming through the earpieces was the chaotic, panicked screaming of men realizing that their invincible equipment was rapidly becoming their death trap. They had lost their tactical initiative. They had lost their communications, and they were, for all intents and purposes, defeated. The retreat was a frantic, uncoordinated scramble. The remaining boats limped away from the choke point, their engines sputtering, their decks slick with the blood of wounded operators. They were leaving behind the very mission they had been sent to accomplish, fleeing back toward the safety of the base while their pride and their reputation was left rotting in the river mud. Back in the command center, the footage of the boats retreating was playing on a loop. It was a bitter, nauseating sight. The most expensive fleet in the world had been humbled by a rusted-out machine gun in the middle of a swamp. The American commanders looked at the screens, their faces drained of color, realizing that they had just committed an act of public tactical suicide.
They were the best, and they had been beaten by the lowest. Why is it that the American military machine, with all its infinite resources, remains so utterly convinced that louder and faster is a substitute for skill? Why does every US operation have to be a cinematic event, broadcasting its intentions to every enemy within 50 miles before a single shot is fired? Are they truly incapable of working in the shadows, or has the Pentagon become so addicted to the theater of war that they've forgotten how to actually fight one? Drop a comment below and let us know your thoughts. Do you think the US military's obsession with overwhelming force is actually a sign of weakness, a lack of the stealth and cunning required for modern asymmetrical conflicts? Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We're about to shift focus to the only people who know how to walk through these jungles without leaving a footprint. While the US generals are still hyperventilating over their failed boats, a quiet, forgotten team of British SBS operators is about to show the world exactly what professionalism actually looks like. Stay tuned, because the American way is about to be humiliated once again. The retreat of the US Navy's SWCC boats was a masterclass in frantic, uncoordinated damage control. As the armored crafts limped back toward the forward operating base, trailing smoke and dragging shattered equipment, the command tent back in the secure zone became a crucible of pure, unfiltered panic. The gold-plated rescue mission, designed to be a triumph of American technological dominance, had collapsed into a bloody wreckage of broken hulls and shredded egos. General Marcus Thorne, the man in charge of the regional theater, stood hunched over a bank of monitors that were now displaying only the grainy, useless static of a lost engagement. He wasn't looking at the tactical situation anymore. He was looking at his own career, watching it dissolve in the face of an insurgent group that had, by all accounts, been dismissed as primitive. His staff officers were frantically scrubbing the communications logs, trying to find a way to frame the failure, blaming the terrain, blaming the unexpected intensity of the enemy's DShK nests, blaming anything other than the obvious reality. Their doctrine was fundamentally flawed. "Get me the air support, Commander," Thorne bellowed, his voice sounding thin and desperate in the sterile, air-conditioned silence of the command center. "I want a flight of B-52s out of the regional hub. If we can't get in there on the river, we'll turn that entire grid into a parking lot. I want the jungle leveled. Every tree, every hut, every square inch of that basin needs to be turned into fire-swept ash." The room went cold. The B-52 solution was the ultimate American admission of defeat. The moment when the military realized it could no longer win on the ground, so it opted to erase the ground itself. It was a strategy born of pure, distilled impotence. They weren't fighting the cartel anymore.
They were fighting their own inability to navigate a world that didn't provide them with a clear, high-definition target. "General," a young intelligence officer interjected, his voice barely a whisper. "The CIA asset. He's still in the basement of the main complex. If we authorize a carpet bombing run, we're effectively signing his death warrant. We're talking about an asset with 20 years of sensitive intelligence in his head." Thorne didn't even look at the officer. He just stared at the map, his eyes glazed with the obsession of a man who needed a win at any cost, regardless of the body count. "He's a casualty of the situation," Thorne replied, his words echoing the cold, corporate detachment of the Pentagon's worst strategic blunders. "We can't have a high-value asset being held as a trophy for these insurgents. If we can't extract him with the current resources, we neutralize the objective. I want the bombers prepped for a 0800 strike."
Get it done. The Americans were prepared to vaporize their own man, their own reputation, and an entire ecosystem of jungle, just to avoid admitting that they had been outplayed. It was the quintessential Yankee way of war, a colossal, resource-heavy monster that had become so bloated and terrified of failure that it would rather destroy everything in sight than lose face. They were treating war like a business transaction, willing to write off the asset to balance the ledgers of their own vanity. It was a staggering display of cowardice wrapped in the guise of decisive action. While they were busy calculating the tonnage of bombs required to wipe a village off the map, the men who had actually been in the boats, the SEALs, were sitting in the infirmary, nursing their wounds and their resentment. They knew they had been used as bait, and now they were being abandoned by a command structure that didn't know how to do anything but level the field. The irony was suffocating. They had the most sophisticated military-industrial complex in human history, an array of sensors that could see through the leaves, and missiles that could strike a window from 1,000 miles away, yet they were completely paralyzed. They were masters of the easy war, the kind fought with push buttons and drone strikes. But the moment they hit the mud, the moment the radios went dead, and the enemy stopped playing by the rules of the simulation, they were helpless. They had become a military that fought with its bank account, not its brain. And the more they spent, the less they seemed to understand about the reality of the fight. They were so busy projecting the image of power, the noise, the speed, the massive displays of iron, that they had forgotten the most basic requirement of counterinsurgency: subtlety. They were acting like a bull in a china shop, expecting the shop to break because they were the bull, and then throwing a tantrum when the shop turned out to be a brick wall. The decision to bomb the jungle was the final, pathetic act of an army that had lost its tactical compass. It was an admission that they were willing to commit a war crime of their own making just to bury the memory of their failure. They were the superpower, and they were being defeated by their own lack of imagination. But while the general was staring at his maps, planning the total destruction of the river basin, there was a quiet, almost invisible shift in the corner of the tent. 4 men had been watching the whole spectacle: the boats failing, the panic, the decision to bomb the asset. They were the SBS liaison team, a small, overlooked group of British operators who had been attached to the task force for intelligence gathering. They didn't look like soldiers of the future. They looked like guys who were tired of watching an amateur production. They weren't planning to level the forest. They weren't planning to sacrifice the asset. And they certainly weren't planning to ask for permission. Why do we continue to tolerate a military system that would rather kill its own people than admit it's been outthought? Is the American approach to total war actually a mask for a deep systemic lack of tactical capability? Are we building an army that is only capable of winning when the enemy stands in an open field and waits to be destroyed? Drop a comment below. Let's talk about the disconnect between the Pentagon's bomb everything mentality and the reality of the modern hidden battlefield. Subscribe and hit the notification bell. We're about to shift focus to the 4 forgotten men who are currently ignoring their orders,
grabbing their gear, and walking into the dark. While the Americans are pre-flighting their bombers, the British are prepping their rebreathers. The jungle is about to be shown what a real professional looks like. Stay tuned, because the humiliation of the Yanks is about to be absolute. The air in the US
command tent was thick enough to choke on, a cocktail of stale air, panicked sweat, and the faint, ozone-heavy scent of overheated servers. General Thorne was still shouting into a secure line, his face a mottled, angry purple as he demanded the strike coordinates for the B-52s. He was a man who had built his reputation on the idea that the American military could bend the world to its will through raw, unadulterated mass. He couldn't grasp the concept that a few miles of jungle and a handful of dirt-poor fighters could render his entire tactical inventory obsolete. In the corner of the tent, leaning against a stack of crates filled with useless, multi-million-dollar drone controllers, stood 4 men. They didn't look like soldiers from a movie. They looked like they had just walked off a fishing trawler. They were members of the Special Boat Service, SBS, the maritime shadow brothers of the SAS. They had spent the last 2 hours listening to the American rescue plan devolve into a farce of carpet bombing and asset sacrifice. The SBS team lead, a man whose presence was so quiet it felt almost aggressive, finally walked over to the command desk. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't salute. He simply laid a small, crumpled map of the river basin onto the general's illuminated display, effectively covering up the flight path of the strategic bombers. "General," he said, his voice a calm, clipped British rasp that sliced through the general's shouting match. "You've spent 72 hours trying to brute force a problem that requires a needle. You're about to kill your own asset, burn your own credibility, and turn a tactical failure into a strategic catastrophe. If you want him back, step aside. We'll have him out in 3 hours." General Thorne stopped shouting. He looked at the British operator as if he had just sprouted a second head. The room erupted into a mixture of genuine shock and mocking laughter. One of the American colonels, a man whose chest was laden with more decorative metal than a parade float, stepped forward with a condescending sneer. 3 hours? You've got to be kidding me. We've got 200 of the best trained SEALs in the world sitting in the infirmary, and you're telling me you 4 are going to walk into that hornet's nest, without air cover, without the gunboats, without so much as a heavy caliber sidearm? The SBS lead didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the colonel. He kept his eyes locked on the general, his gaze flat and unblinking. "We don't need your gunboats. They make too much noise. We don't need your air cover. We don't want the jungle to know we're coming. We're going to swim." "Swim?" the general scoffed, a dark, cynical laugh escaping his throat. "You're going to swim 3 miles through a river that's guarded by DShK nests, sniper teams, and a cartel that knows every log and rock in that water. You're not going to swim, Colonel. You're going to go for a funeral parade. It's an insane, suicidal, idiotic gamble. I'm not authorizing it. You're staying on base." The British operator pulled a small, high-tech piece of equipment from his rucksack, a rebreather system that looked more like a piece of medical gear than a weapon of war. He placed it on the table. It was a closed circuit system, completely silent, leaving no bubbles, no trace, and no signature. It was the antithesis of the American way of war. It didn't announce its presence. It simply existed in the environment. "We aren't asking for authorization, General," the Briton replied, his voice chillingly polite. "We're informing you of the timeline. In 3 hours, your asset will be at the rally point. Whether he arrives with a pulse is up to you. If you launch those bombers, you're the one who pulls the trigger on your own man." "We're going in now. With that, the 4 British operators turned on their heels and walked out of the tent, leaving the American command staff in a state of absolute paralyzed fury. The colonels were already shouting about insubordination, protocol, and the danger to the coalition's operational security. They were terrified at the liability. They were terrified that these 4 men would succeed and make them look like the bloated, incompetent amateurs that they were. They weren't just angry at the British. They were angry at the insult. To the American military mind, a mission isn't a mission unless it involves a massive logistical tail, a mountain of high-end tech, and a clear, decisive show of force. The idea that 4 men could simply bypass all of that and solve the problem through sheer, disciplined audacity was an affront to their entire existence. It stripped away the vanity of their profession. As the SBS team headed for the dark, swirling waters of the river, they didn't look back at the base. They didn't care about the general's orders. They had been bred in a tradition that stretched back to the canoe raids of the Second World War, a tradition that understood that the most effective weapon in the world isn't a minigun. It's the ability to become invisible. They stripped down into their wetsuits, their bodies disappearing into the gloom of the riverbank. They weren't carrying heavy loadouts. They weren't carrying the operator aesthetic. They were carrying enough explosive, enough ammunition, and enough willpower to dismantle the cartel's entire operation from the inside out. They were walking into the jaws of a beast that had just chewed up the US Navy's best. And they were going to do it in total, eerie, terrifying silence. The Americans back in the command tent were already scrambling to document the failure, preparing the press releases to explain why the inevitable tragedy of the asset's death was an unavoidable consequence of the terrain. They were already mourning a man who wasn't dead yet, simply because they were too scared to see him rescued by anyone other than themselves. Is this the final evolution of the superpower? An organization that is so paralyzed by its own bureaucracy that it would rather let an asset die than accept help from a smaller, smarter, and more daring force? Is the American way of war becoming a theater of the absurd, where the appearance of control matters more than the actual result? Drop a comment below. Let's talk about the disconnect between the Pentagon's big-picture arrogance and the reality of the small team surgical operation. Subscribe and hit that bell, because in the next block we're going to submerge into the dark, murky waters of the river with the SBS. You're going to see why 4 guys in wetsuits are more dangerous than an entire flotilla of armored gunboats. The Yanks are watching their screens, waiting for the bombers to launch, but the British are already inside the wire. The jungle is quiet, and for the cartel, the silence is about to turn into a nightmare. The jungle night was not dark. It was a sensory deprivation tank of humidity and black, stagnant water. 3 miles upstream, the SBS team slipped into the river like ink dropping into a glass of water. They didn't hit the surface with a splash. They didn't trigger the movement sensors of the cartel's perimeter defense. They simply ceased to exist above the waterline. Their rebreathers, closed circuit systems that scrubbed carbon dioxide and recycled oxygen, ensured that not a single bubble broke the surface tension. They weren't fighting the river, they were becoming part of its chemistry. While the American boats had roared against the current, churning the water and broadcasting their arrival to every predatory creature and sentry within 5 miles, the British moved with the slow, deliberate crawl of the riverbed itself. They swam through the silt and the tangled, submerged mangrove roots, their navigation performed not by GPS or high-end inertial systems, but by the ancient, hardwired sense of direction that only comes from years of deep jungle reconnaissance. They reached the perimeter of the cartel's fortified river camp in 45 minutes. Where the Americans had been met with a wall of DShK fire because they were the loudest things on the water, the British were ghosts. They surfaced in the reeds 20 meters from the cartel's main pier. One by one, they broke the surface. No sound, no splash,
just the low, rhythmic hiss of their rebreathers being disconnected. They didn't need the Americans' total information dominance. They had eyes. They had ears. They had an ironclad tactical discipline that had been forged in the crucible of the SBS selection course, a pipeline that makes American Hell Week look like a weekend retreat. The cartel guards were still jumpy, their eyes glued to the river, still scanning for the silhouette of another US boat, still terrified that the gringos would return with more heavy metal. They were looking for a war of attrition. They were looking for an assault. They weren't looking for 4 men who had already been inside their perimeter for 10 minutes. The SBS team moved toward the central holding structure, a reinforced multi-room concrete blockhouse, like shadows detaching themselves from the jungle wall. The lead operator, Jay, didn't signal with hand gestures that might be caught in the moonlight. He moved with a subtle, fluid nudge of his partner's shoulder. They reached the base of the holding facility, a drainage pipe serving as their breach point. While the Americans would have used a shaped charge to blow the door, creating a shock wave that would have been felt in the next village, the British used a high-torque mechanical tool to pop the seal. Inside, the bunker was a labyrinth of humidity and the stench of decay.
The 2 guarding the prisoner were sitting in plastic chairs, their AK-47s leaning against the wall, their attention focused on a flickering television set. They never saw the door open. They never saw the men in the wet black neoprene suits. They only felt the sudden cold pressure of a suppressed MP5SD muzzle against the base of their skulls. Thwip! 2 rounds, 2 bodies. The guards were slumped over before the floor could even absorb the sound of their descent. The prisoner, a gaunt, terrified man who had been expecting a B-52 strike to end his life, looked up to see a man in a dripping wet wetsuit offering him a canteen of water. "CIA asset," the SBS operator whispered, his voice as calm as a summer breeze. The man nodded, his eyes wide. "We're taking you for a swim," the operator replied. "Don't make a sound." They didn't waste time with debriefing or intelligence exploitation. They didn't need to hold the room or call for an extraction helicopter. They were moving out the way they moved in, through the back pressure of the jungle's own defenses. The cartel's outer ring of guards was still focused on the river, still scanning the horizon for the next American gunboat, completely unaware that their high-value prisoner had been spirited out from under their noses. The entire 15-minute shredding of the cartel's security bubble was a masterclass in the economy of violence. They didn't kill anyone they didn't have to. They didn't fire a single shot that wasn't aimed at a target that threatened the asset. They treated the entire camp as a lock to be picked, not a wall to be smashed. It was a cold, efficient, and deeply professional piece of work that stood in stark contrast to the chaotic, screaming mess of the American assault. As they slipped back into the water, the asset in tow, the jungle was still screaming with the distant, frantic chatter of the cartel's radios. The guards had finally discovered the 2 dead men in the bunker, and they were tearing the camp apart, searching for an enemy that was already 300 meters downstream, moving through the current like a school of predatory fish. The SBS team lead checked his watch, an old, non-digital diver's watch that would never fail because of a battery glitch. They were ahead of schedule. They were moving through the water, the asset breathing through a spare mask, the entire extraction unfolding with the grace of a well-rehearsed stage play. There were no drones overhead to witness the glory. There were no satellites to record the kill count. There was only the river, the jungle, and 4 men who didn't care about the accolades. This is the thinking soldier in his purest form. It's the ability to discard the ego, the gear, and the theatrics in favor of the only thing that actually moves the needle in a real-world conflict: the mission. The Americans had tried to win with power. The British were winning with physics. Why are we still obsessed with the idea that the biggest is the best? Why does the American military-industrial complex continue to push the narrative that technology is the ultimate arbiter of victory, when the most successful operations in the history of special warfare have been won by men who understood that the environment is your weapon, not the thing you're trying to destroy? Drop a comment below. Let's talk about the disconnect between the show of force and the reality of the fight. Subscribe and hit the bell. We're about to shift to the final block, the moment of truth back at the coalition base. The B-52s are warming up. The general is practicing his speech about acceptable losses, and the British are about to drop a wet, muddy, and very alive CIA asset onto the center of his map. The humiliation of the Yankee command is about to be absolute. Stay tuned. This is the truth of the battlefield.
The sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the jagged peaks of the river basin in shades of bruised purple and harsh, unforgiving orange. Back at the forward operating base, the mood was approaching a state of terminal, industrial-grade insanity. General Thorne was standing by the runway, his hand trembling as he held the direct-to-command line with the strategic bomber wing. The B-52s were in the air, their massive four-engine silhouettes cutting through the morning haze like vultures circling a carcass. He was minutes away from ordering the total, indiscriminate annihilation of the grid, an act of strategic arson meant to cover the stench of his own tactical incompetence. "General," his lead pilot crackled over the secure radio, "we are on station. Target acquisition is locked. We are waiting for the final code. Are we clear to proceed with the primary objective?" Thorne opened his mouth to give the order. He was ready to delete the problem. He was ready to turn the river, the jungle, and his own asset into a smoking, radioactive-level crater, just so he could report mission failure due to overwhelming hostile presence, rather than mission failure due to my own stupidity. But then the sound reached them. It wasn't the roar of jet engines or the thrum of a helicopter. It was the sound of a heavy, metal-latched gate swinging open. Every eye on the flight line turned toward the main tactical tent. The SBS team walked out from the dark, damp periphery of the jungle, their wetsuits glistening with river muck, their bodies coated in the grey, slick sludge of the basin. They were dragging, not carrying, but dragging, a man who looked like he'd been pulled through a meat grinder, but who was unmistakably alive, breathing, and wide-eyed with the shock of salvation. The CIA asset, the man Thorne had essentially sentenced to death in his pursuit of a clean narrative, collapsed into the arms of the base medical team, coughing up river water and sobbing with relief.
The 4 British operators stopped in front of the general. They didn't stand at attention. They didn't wait for a debrief. They simply stood there, dripping, turning the pristine, high-tech command tarmac into a swamp of mud and river debris. The SBS team lead stepped forward, reached into the damp pocket of his vest, and pulled out a small, waterproof GPS tracker, the very one the CIA asset had been wearing. He dropped it into the general's hand. It clattered against the general's expensive tactical watch, a small plastic reminder of the mission he had spent 3 days failing. "The asset is secure, General," the Briton said, his voice a flat, deadpan whisper that carried further than a loudspeaker. "You can call off your lawnmowers. The target is neutralized, and the jungle is still standing. I'd suggest you use your bombers for something else. Maybe a practice run. You clearly need the training." The silence that descended upon the flight line was absolute.
It was the silence of a superpower realizing that it had just been beaten at its own game by a force that didn't even have a budget line item for jungle carpet bombing. The American Marines, the SEALs, the pilots in the B-52s, everyone watched as the British operators turned their backs on the general and began walking toward their own quarters, leaving a trail of wet, black mud behind them. General Thorne looked at the radio in his hand. He looked at the B-52s circling like sharks above. He looked at the asset being carried to the infirmary. He had the military. He had the machines. And he had the authority. But he had been rendered completely, utterly irrelevant. He had been humiliated, not by a superior force, but by the fact that he was simply unnecessary. He didn't give the order to bomb. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, the weight of the moment pressing down on him, realizing that his entire career had just been reduced to a footnote in the story about 4 men who knew how to swim.
The Pentagon's PR machine went into overdrive by noon. They released a statement about a highly successful joint coalition operation and flawless coordination between British and American forces. They tried to scrub the mud off the floor, they tried to bury the rebreathers, and they tried to pretend that the B-52s were always intended to be a demonstration of force. But the truth, in the world of special operations, is like water. It finds the cracks. This is the reality that defense contractors don't want you to know. The American way of war is a product. It is a show. It is designed to be big, loud, expensive, and easy to sell to the taxpayers. But when the show ends and the lights go out, it is almost always the quiet, professional, and vastly more capable teams like the SBS who do the work that actually matters. They don't need the miniguns. They don't need the bombers. They don't even need the permission. They only need the one thing that money can't buy. The absolute, unwavering competence of a soldier who knows that war is won in the dark, not in the press release. If you're tired of the Hollywood version of military history, if you want the truth about who actually wins when the cameras are turned off, then hit that subscribe button. We are here to dismantle the myth of the superpower and show you exactly what happens when true expertise meets administrative bloat. Drop a comment below. Do you think the Pentagon will ever learn that you can't buy tactical discipline with a procurement contract? Or are they forever doomed to build bigger boats that get sunk by smaller men? We read every single comment, and we want to know what you think. Hit that bell, stay observant, and never forget, the loudest weapon on the battlefield is usually the one that's accomplishing the least. The British are already back in their compound, drinking their tea, and the Americans are back to polishing their drones. Stay sharp. The real history of the world